I call Keith Block.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Green Party will be opposing this bill because it could have a disastrous effect on both the National Library and Archives New Zealand. And these two institutions are so important, not only for the present generation but for future generations of New Zealanders. We're particularly worried that putting the Archives New Zealand as a subordinate agency within the Department of Internal Affairs could undermine its important constitutional role. And we believe it should not and must not lose the independence it gained, particularly through the Public Records Act, putting into statute the independence of the Chief Archivist. In fact, we see in this bill a step backwards to the situation that existed last century when the archives and the Chief Archivist were in fact subordinate to the Department of Internal Affairs and the CEO of that agency. We have been going in a good direction since the Public Records Act and implementing the 1985 UNESCO guidelines, which insist on the constitutional independence of the archives in a country. And the reason for the independence, I think we need to look at what is the reason for the independence of other bodies who are officers of Parliament. In fact, that is the Ombudsman and the Auditor General. A key reason is that potentially both these bodies, both these officers, are in conflict with the government. The Ombudsman and the Auditor General sometimes give what could be described as very critical reports as to the behaviour of the executive. So maintaining that independence is critical. And I think that's not fully understood, the importance of the Archives New Zealand to holding governments to account. The Archives and Records Association of New Zealand says that this independence is important to maintain, quote, the ability to keep governments accountable for their actions through the records they create and maintain, end quote. And there's always going to be a tension, this was brought out in the debate around the Public Records Act, a tension between the Chief Archivist and CEOs of different departments as to what records are kept and what aren't, and there's always a tendency for executives to define certain material as classified and shouldn't be transferred to the archives, or if it is, it should be kept classified, or material that's embarrassing, perhaps we should get rid of this, perhaps it shouldn't be transferred to the National Archives. There will always be those conflicts, and actually you'll have those conflicts with the Department of Internal Affairs' own records when they transfer to the Archives New Zealand, and if the Chief Archivist is subordinate to the CEO of the DIA, then that creates a problem. We've already seen public discussion over, for example, the transfer of some of David Longy's papers to Archives New Zealand, some GCSB papers, and there was an argument over whether they were secret, whether they were not, whether they're classified, what should be done with them, whether they should be culled out of the archives, etc. We've had a debate around the SIS records and found out that before the Public Records Act was passed, the SIS got rid of a lot of records that it shouldn't have gotten. People have been writing recently to ask for their records since the SIS rightly adopted a more open policy to the release of archives. They find that, they were destroyed years ago. In fact, the archive on my own father, which family asked for, that had been got rid of by the SIS a few years back, and which is very bad, not only for the family but for the historical records. So that conflict over archives is quite important, and you can see, if you use a parallel with the Ombudsman and the Auditor General, If the Ombudsman's office was put subordinate under the Minister of Justice and the Ombudsman was in effect subordinate to the Chief Executive of the Minister of Justice, how that would undermine the independence of the Ombudsman's office. Similarly, if the Auditor General's office was put under Treasury, then that would undermine the Auditor General's independent role. So, and there have been various lobby groups since this move was announced, including a lot of former people in the archivists, leading people in the National Archives, librarians, all sorts of people have been very concerned about this move and describing what happened when previously the archives was subordinate to the DIA, unlawful destruction of records, there was court actions, there was a weakening of regional offices of the archives, and not least budgetary problems, in that it's so easy for a chief executive of the DIA to say, well, we're a bit short this year, or the government's asked for 5% or 10% cuts, whatever it might be, just let's slow up on the purchase of materials for the National Library, or transfer of stuff to the archives for a year, save a bit of money that way, nobody will notice, or few people will notice, and we'll get away with it. That's why it's important to have the organisational and budgetary independence of Archives New Zealand and the National Library, so they continue to get their collections up to proper standard, because once you've fallen behind, it's very hard to catch up, or very hard to purchase books that were in print and are now out of print, etc., etc. Now, the argument is that, all these agencies, National Archives, National Library, births and deaths and marriages, they'll all be under the DIA, and it's all to do with digitalisation, making these records available to the public, etc. Whereas, in fact, the role of the different agencies is quite, I think the Minister said there's a common focus on using digital technology and making government information widely accessible to citizens through the internet. Well, in fact, you're developing there a more populist role for the National Archives, rather than collecting information that you don't even know will be useful in the future. And there was talk by an earlier speaker about some of the material that iwi now make available that wasn't necessarily collected because it was seen as useful at the time, but it's the historical record and made use of by future generations. There's nothing wrong with cooperating on digital platforms. Independent agencies can use the same platforms, exchange technology, use the same payroll systems, contract out for payroll systems, whatever they might do, but they don't need to be merged in the way that this bill proposes. There's also the question of the different roles of the DIA and libraries and archives. You can argue, for example, that libraries are about provision of information to people, to the public. Archives are about accumulating evidence, whether or not it is useful to the public at the present time, and that's the importance of its constitutional role. And a section of the DIA is about the very opposite, about censorship. In fact, the Library Association of New Zealand, and some of the stuff they've written about this move which they oppose, as it says, libraries adhere to the general principle of freedom of information, whereas the Department of Internal Affairs has a censorship role which could potentially result in a conflict. So you have different roles. Some of the material the librarians want to put into a library, the censors in the other part of the Department of Internal Affairs saying, hold on, this should be banned and this should be excluded, this should be not made available. So you see a conflict of roles here. So if we're really to be true to the basic principles underlying our National Library collection and our Archives New Zealand, they should remain separate from each other and independent of the Department of Internal Affairs, and so that the Chief Archivist is not a subordinate player to the Chief Executive of the Department of Internal Affairs. Thank you.